Welcome to this module of Professor Messer's free CompTIA A+ certification training course. I'm James Messer, and in this module we're going to install Windows 2000. We're going to talk about what we're going to need, and then we'll perform an actual installation of Windows 2000. The requirements from this come from CompTIA's Essentials Exam 220-601, Section 3.2, where we need to install, configure, optimize, and upgrade operating systems. And you can see a number of the procedures that are important for installing Windows 2000. In this video, we're specifically going to go through a pre-install checklist. We're going to install Windows 2000. We're going to verify that our installation actually worked. That would be nice. And we're going to, after the installation, go through a post-install. Once you have the operating system installed, you're not done. There's some things that have to occur once you've got the operating system completely installed. So let's go through our pre-install checklist. What do we need to know prior to installing our operating system? We have a few of the requirements here. These are the same requirements we saw in one of our previous videos that talked about what we needed as a minimum for Windows 2000 and what our recommendations were. So as we step through our system, we need to make sure it's a Pentium 133, it's got 64 meg of RAM, 650 meg of hard drive space, and some of these other media and video configurations as well. Before we begin the installation, now that we know our minimum requirements, let's also think about the software that we're going to use once the operating system is on. Now, we certainly have a list of things that we would normally use in our operating system, so we need to list these things out. Do we use audio editing software? Do we use word processing software? Is there imaging editing software that we use? Even things we don't use very often, we should probably make a list of and make sure that the applications are going to work in Windows 2000. In some cases, if we're using an older operating system like Windows NT, the application may work in 2000 or it may not. We may need an upgrade to that operating system. There also may be a number of processes that are different in 2000 than they are in other operating systems. So if we're used to doing backups a certain way, we need to make sure that the process for doing backups is either the same or very similar, or we know the way to perform backups the way we would like to do them even in that operating system. That's just one example of the processes that we normally use. You also have third-party components you plug in. If you sync everything to your mobile phone, you may want to make sure that that sync process is going to work similarly in Windows 2000 as it is in the other operating systems that you might use. So go out and check the manufacturers of the hardware that you have, the applications you're using. You may require an upgrade to be able to work properly in the operating system that we're about to install. So let's perform an installation of Windows 2000. Rather than step through a bunch of slides, let's do one interactively. I have a system up and running on our computer. I've got a virtual machine that I've installed nothing's on there currently. I've set it up and ready to go for Windows 2000 Professional. And I've got some memory configurations here, hard drive settings, CD-ROM. Let's see if these match our minimum configurations. I've set up this virtual machine with 256 megabytes of memory. That's plenty for what we're doing here. Our minimum was 64 meg. We need at least, I believe it's 640 megabytes. Well, we've got 2 gigs. So I know that I'm meeting not only my minimum requirement, but even I'm exceeding my recommended for Windows 2000. So I have plenty of hard drive space. I'm also installing this from a CD-ROM. So I've got my Drive H, a Windows 2000 CD right now. And I'm going to use that and boot from that CD-ROM to get everything going. If I had floppy disks for my installation, I would put my floppy boot disk in there. Windows 2000 usually shipped with a floppy disk and a CD-ROM. And if you needed more floppies only, you could put that CD-ROM in a system and it would make floppies for you to use on other computers. But in our case, we're going to do everything from our CD-ROM. And I've got the normal Ethernet and USB and other components like sound devices inside of my virtual machine that we can use as well. To begin the installation, we need to start the computer. We've got our CD-ROM, their Windows 2000 CD-ROM is in the system. So let's start her up. I'm going to just hit the power button on this virtual machine, if you will, and it's going to launch the operating system, and we're going to boot from our CD-ROM. During the boot process, this Windows 2000 setup screen occurs, and this is if we're booting from that CD-ROM. If you happen to turn on one of your computers after the installation and you notice this is still coming up, then you've forgotten to take your CD-ROM out of the drive. You're going to want to pull that out of there so that you can then have your setup process not run now every time you start up your computer. So as it runs through this, it loads an initial set of drivers, and then it says that it is starting Windows 2000. So let's see it go through this process and see what it comes up with. The first prompt that we get when starting Windows 2000 Professional in this interactive mode, it says to set up Windows 2000 now, we can press Enter. To repair a Windows 2000 installation, press R, or to quit, press F3. Now, the repair part is useful if we had loaded Windows 2000 and something happened to our installation. We can reinstall some of the system files to see if that helps with our problem. In our case, we just like to set up Windows 2000 now, so we're going to press Enter. A screen's going to pop up that says your hard drive is brand new, it's been erased, or it's running an operating system that's incompatible with Windows 2000. Now, in our case, we know that we're starting from scratch. It's a completely blank hard drive, so the setup process is correct. If there was an operating system already on this drive that is something that Windows didn't recognize, that could also be a problem. So you may want to delete what's on that drive prior to starting, just to be sure we have a good setup. Now, if it's incompatible, it's even telling you that continue this setup, you may damage or even destroy the operating system that's there already. So make sure you don't continue through this process if there's something on that drive you're going to want to use for later. To continue, it says press C. To quit, press F3. So let's press C and see what comes up. First thing we get is a licensing agreement that says that this is the end user license agreement, the EULA, E-U-L-A. And this end user license agreement is the license that you have with Microsoft for using this piece of software. Now for Windows 2000, it says that you can hit F8 to agree, escape not to agree, or page down to read everything. So you can page through this and read the requirements that are here. Talks about how you can back up the operating system, how you can have different archive pieces there, and how it's used. If we agree with what's in the licensing agreement, we can simply press F8 to agree. Windows 2000 setup then says that you've got it's time to partition the hard drive. And it looks at our hard drive and says, well, you've got a 2 gig hard drive. That's correct. And it is completely unpartitioned right now. There's nothing partitioned in this piece. And we're going to do another video later that talks about partitioning, because we may want to separate this drive up into many pieces, maybe put different partitions in different places, put different operating systems on different partitions. But in this case, we're going to be very simple. We're going to take the entire 2 gig drive and just put Windows 2000 on the entire drive. So to set up Windows 2000 on the selected item, which is this one unpartitioned space, we're going to press Enter. There was a partition here we wanted to delete. Notice that we could delete it from here as well. So it's one way that you can clean the drive off during the installation process itself. If we wanted to create a different size of this, maybe not use the full 2 gig, we could press C and we could type in exactly the amount that we would like to use. In our case though, I'm going to hit escape and we'll just use the entire 2 gig area. It says we've created a new partition just that quickly. We now have a new partition, but before we can use it, you've got to format the partition. So we're going to select how the type of file system that we would like to use to partition this with. For the most part, you're going to want to use NTFS. If you're using older operating systems or different operating systems that don't recognize NTFS and you'd like to load them on the same drive, you may want to use the File Allocation Table file system, or FAT. In our case, we're only going to be using Windows 2000, and we'd like to take advantage of some of the capabilities within NTFS. So let's format the partition using the NTFS file system. I'll just hit Enter. And it brings up this screen that says we're going to format the partition. It's currently the C drive, which is completely new. It's never been formatted before, and it's 2 gig. And notice it goes through that very, very quickly. Boom, it's partitioned to everything. It's formatted and partitioned that entire drive, and now starts copying files from the Windows 2000 installation folder onto the hard drive itself. And because I'm going from this very fast CD-ROM, these are copied very, very quickly, and you can see them go by. It's going to copy as much information as it can, or that it needs to, from the CD-ROM or the installation media, put it on the hard drive, and then begin the installation process. So it's a multi-step process to get this going. But now that these files have been taken off of the media, the rest of the installation goes very, very quickly. So don't worry if you're running with a slow media like floppy disks or CD-ROMs. What you'll find is once it finishes this process, the rest of this runs very, very quickly. Now that we've copied everything over, it says that we've completed doing everything there. If there's a floppy disk in drive A, remove it. If we want to restart ourselves right now, we can press Enter, or notice that it's automatically going to reboot in just a few seconds. So we're going to let it go through that process and let it reboot. And as it starts up, you'll notice we get a new splash screen, Windows 2000 Professional, built on NT technology, and it is starting up this installation setup for the very first time. So as it goes through this, you'll notice that the hard drive's moving. There is a little graphic on the screen that tends to move back and forth, so you can at least see there's some activity. And it may stutter like it did just now and then catch up with itself as Windows is going out and looking at the hardware that you have here, doing some queries, looking at the hard drive, finding out what type of other hardware happens to be in your system, and then continuing on with the setup process. Now, if it sits here for a long period of time and nothing is moving, then you may have a problem. We have to go through some troubleshooting processes to determine what piece of hardware in your system isn't responding properly. If everything works well, we'll start getting some of the screens that we see here as Windows 2000 is booting up in the installation program for the very first time. Now, the setup program tells us that we're going to launch this, says please wait, and we have this launch screen that appears. The first interactive prompt we get says that we're now starting the wizard for the Windows 2000 Professional on our computer and to click Next to continue. Setup is going to install the keyboard, the mouse drivers, some video drivers on your system. Make sure that everything is running the way we would expect here, and it's going to make sure that these systems are available for us to use during the installation process. If there are drivers in our Windows 2000 Professional that it can start to use for the keyboard, for the mouse, then it will take advantage of them as we continue on with the installation program. Now that Windows 2000 has finished looking at the different pieces of hardware in your system, it's come up with some options for us to choose regions and languages. So we can see our system locales right here. It says the system locale is set to United States English and the user locale is set to United States English. That's what we'd like on our system. If we wanted to customize that, we could click the Customize button and choose the area, the location in the world that we would like to have our operating system use. We can also change the keyboard layout. This says it's the US keyboard layout, but if we'd like to use a different keyboard layout, we've got the option to do that as well. Well, we're on the US in this case, so I'm going to click Next. Now Windows prompts us to put in our username, our name that we're going to use to identify this license. This is not the username that we'll use for the operating system. It's the one that's going to personalize the software that we have on here. So we're going to put some defaults here for me and Professor Messer. Then it asks for a product key. This is something that you'll find on every Windows product. It needs a product key, and these are individualized per license of operating system. In a large environment, you may have a site license, and so you don't need to put an individual key on every single system. But for individual installations, generally, you do require a key in this Windows 2000 Professional to get this running. So I'm going to blank it out so you can't see it, but I'm going to add the key that's for our system here. Once we have our key installed, if we've typed everything properly, we can click Next. Now that we've licensed our system, Windows 2000 wants to give a name to this computer. This is not a name for the user who's using this computer. This is a name that identifies this computer itself on the network. The person logging into this computer could be very different than the name of the device itself. So we're going to call this computer 2K. This is our Windows 2000 computer. How original, right? And it also says that we're going to create an account on this machine called administrator, and you need to provide a password to this. Don't ever leave this blank because this gives you full access to the computer. You want this to be something very secret. So we'll put in an administrator password and we'll confirm it in that box and we'll click Next. Then it says, what's the date and time? We'll make sure that our date and time looks right. We'll make sure the time zone that we're in is correct. We are in as we're filming this, we're in the Eastern time zone, so I'll choose Eastern time, and I'll tell Windows to automatically adjust my clock if daylight savings time comes along. And we'll click Next. Now that we have identified this computer, we've licensed it, Windows is now going to set up the network. And we're going to tell the Windows configuration that we're going to use typical settings, which installs normal client for Microsoft Networks, file and print sharing, and TCP/IP protocol to be able to communicate over the network. If your network is any different than that, you'll want to choose some custom settings that allows you to manually decide what pieces of this you'd like to load up into your environment. This also says, are you on the domain or are you on a work group? And in our case, in our small office, we are on a work group. But if you're in a larger environment, you're certainly going to be part of a domain. So as we mentioned in the pre-install, we want to be sure that we know what type of networking that we're going to connect to. So we're going to connect to a work group in our environment. We're not going to connect to a domain, and we're going to connect to the Pegasus work group. And we'll click next. And now setup is actually going to do some things. We're going to now let it go through its process of copying some files over, doing a few things. And this process generally goes pretty quick. We've now answered all the questions that we needed to answer to have Windows go through and finish the part that it needs to complete with its networking components. Now the final set of tasks that Windows is going to do is install some start menu items. It's going to register some components, save our settings, and get rid of any temporary files that it used during the setup process. Even though Windows 2000 isn't very big, you'll notice that this is very time consuming to have it go through and copy these files over and make sure that we've got the settings right. And now you can start to see why the unattended configurations or the installations over the network are very small additions to the efficiency of the installation process. But when you're doing a lot of different installations, it can really come in handy. Well, now the setup is complete, and our professional setup program says that we have successfully completed our Windows 2000 setup. So we've done everything we needed to do. It says if there's a CD in our drive, we need to remove it. And to restart our computer, we click Finish. Let's see if it actually worked. Let's verify our configuration. As our Windows starts up again, it's going to go through and load up for the very first time our Windows 2000 professional configuration. If everything went well during the configuration, we should at least get the startup process to complete properly and get no errors during the process. If something was to drastically go wrong, we're going to start seeing things like blue screens of death pop up. And those are those horrid blue screens we don't want to see that have a lot of error messages on it, and the operating system stops completely. If everything was correctly, we're going to see then a login prompt, and we're going to have a way now to start Windows 2000 and log into the user interface. And as we can see, we got past the opening splash screen. Windows is starting up. And the first thing it says is we're not quite done. We need to identify our computer on the network. So let's hit a link here, and it says who can log on to this computer. And we need to decide the usernames and passwords of who gets to log on. This is something you're only going to see the first time you start up Windows 2000. So we're going to say that we have one person here who is the person we identified during the setup process. Even though we put that in during the licensing, it didn't actually make a user. The only user we really made during that licensing was the administrative password. And instead of using this option, I don't recommend using the Windows always assumes the following user. I like to say, forget that. You must enter a username and password to ever use this computer. You'll find in later versions of Windows, this is not even an option. There's no way you want to automatically log someone into Windows these days. And then we can click Finish, and Windows is going to say, all right, Mr. Smart Guy, you need to now install or log into your installation every time you start up Windows. So we know we have an administrator login. Let's put in our administrator account and username, if I can type it correctly. There we go. A couple times. That's something you don't want to forget is your Windows configuration. And so now Windows has started up. We can see that it plays our little log on music, and we should get a user desktop to start up. And there's our Windows 2000 desktop. Now, how do you get started? Here's what you can do. And you can do everything you'd like to do in our Windows 2000 environment. Now, one of the things before we continue on is what you want to do post installation. So we've now started up and finished what we wanted to do from the installation perspective, but what about afterwards? What do we want to do after we've got everything installed? Let's look at our checklist there. The first thing we want to know is, does it work? When we start it up, are we getting any errors? Is it working exactly as we expected? If it doesn't boot, then we've got bigger problems with device drivers, with the hardware itself, and we're going to have to do more troubleshooting. Sometimes we'll let it boot up for the very first time, and then we'll just let it sit there. Before you even log in, there are a number of drivers that continue to load even after the login process. So occasionally, if this is especially unknown hardware, you've installed it for the very first time, you just let it start up and let the hard drive continue to click through and let that login prompt just stay on the screen. You don't touch it for a while just to make sure that it's going to start up exactly like you expect. You also now need to do some more installations. You're not done yet. You need to make sure that you have the latest service pack installed for Windows, that you have the latest security patches, that the drivers for the printers and the other third-party devices that are connected to your computer are up to the latest version of those drivers. And you may need to reinstall or install some application updates that weren't on your system. If you're doing an upgrade, those apps may already be there. If this is a fresh install like we just did, obviously there's going to be some applications that we're going to need to install. So we've got a lot more to do after this process. It would be nice to know in our Windows environment if we are running at the latest service pack. And if we right mouse click on my computer, we can choose Properties. And that brings us up to the System Properties tab. And if we choose this, you can see that we're running Microsoft Windows 2000 version 5.00.2195. Now that is not the latest version. So we're going to want to go out to Microsoft, search for Windows 2000 Service Pack, download the latest service pack, and make sure we're up to speed with that. So already we've got some work to do. Even though we've got our operating system installed, we've got a lot more we have to take care of. In review, we've gone through an entire installation of Windows 2000 from the starting to the end. We've gone through a pre-install checklist to make sure we have all the components and hardware that we need. We did an online interactive installation of Windows 2000. We have verified that our installation works, and we went through a post-install checklist. And there are a number of things we know that we still have to work on even after the operating system itself has been installed. If you'd like to look at more of our operating system videos, any of our A+ videos that we have online for free, participate in our message boards, and much more, you can visit our website, freeaplus.com.